On 7 July 1945, dawn broke over Germany, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood silent, staring at maps that no longer promised peace. He had not slept, his uniform smelled of smoke and paper. And the war he had won now demanded a different sacrifice. Outside his headquarters, soldiers waited. German prisoners shuffled under guard. And cameras were being prepared for history. Across Europe, millions were displaced. Armies were rearranging lines of surrender. And politics was replacing gunfire. In those fragile hours, Eisenhower faced a choice. One that balanced humanity against image. And consequence against applause. American officers reported that nearly 100,000 German troops were ready to capitulate, seeking safety under Western custody, not Soviet hands. At the same time, a victory parade was being discussed. A symbolic moment to show unity, strength, and control. The prisoners could be marched east or west. Their fate tied to a gesture, a photograph, a headline. Eisenhower understood faces would be framed and smiles captured, while columns of defeated men vanished into camps. What appeared as a simple logistical decision on that July morning was about to reshape thousands of lives. Berlin lay in ruins, yet its future was undecided. Borders were imaginary lines, and power was shifting quietly. The Soviets pressed from the east, demanding prisoners as proof of victory, while the West watched cautiously. Every order Eisenhower signed carried weight, measured in lives surrendered or saved, and reputations carved in history. For the men behind the wire, fear was immediate. Hunger was constant, and hope depended on an unseen signature. As engines idled and photographers adjusted lenses, the general inhaled slowly, knowing this moment would define him. By midday on 8 July 1945, Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims became a crossroads of ambition, fear, and calculation. Messengers moved fast through corridors, papers changed hands, and decisions hardened before anyone could object. The general listened as advisors debated optics, logistics, and Soviet expectations, each argument heavy with consequence. What the public would see was order and dignity. What history would record was far more complicated. The proposed parade was not celebration alone, it was theater for allies, rivals, and future negotiations. Uniformed Americans marching through captured territory sent a message. Strength remained with the West. But space was limited, roads were needed. And prisoner columns became inconvenient obstacles to choreography. Moving German captives eastward solved problems quickly, quietly, and without headlines. Eisenhower understood exactly what transfer meant. Soviet camps were brutal. Revenge was systematic, mercy was rare. Reports from liberated zones described starvation, forced labor, and disappearances that never reached official communiques. Yet diplomatic pressure mounted. Stalin demanded bodies as proof, and refusal risked fragile cooperation. The war was over, but peace had rules written in ink that smelled like blood. Orders were drafted late in the afternoon. Transport routes marked in red pencil, signatures pressed firmly. Trucks rolled, guards shouted, and columns of Germans began moving toward an uncertain horizon. Some prisoners believed captivity was ending. Others sensed something darker in the silence of their escorts. No speeches accompanied them, no cameras followed. Only dust, exhaustion, and dread. Meanwhile, photographers captured Eisenhower smiling, shaking hands, embodying victory and restraint. The image traveled faster than the prisoners ever would. Printed cleanly, stripped of consequence. In Washington and London, applause followed. While in forests and rail yards, men vanished from memory. The trade was complete, order exchanged for image. Lives weighed against a moment of triumph. On 9 July 1945, the first reports began returning. Quietly filtered through intelligence channels. Deliberately softened for comfort. Rail lines leading east were congested. Prisoner counts were altered. And destinations were labeled as temporary holding zones. Eisenhower read these summaries in silence. His face controlled, his thoughts less so. He had commanded invasions. ordered bombings, and accepted casualties. Yet this felt different. German officers who surrendered expecting Western captivity now realized the truth. As Soviet guards replaced American uniforms, personal items were stripped away, ranks were ignored, and interrogations began immediately. Some men tried to explain agreements. Others begged for American officers. But the lines had already closed. History had moved on, and they had been left behind. Inside Allied command circles, justification hardened. The transfers were framed as unavoidable, even necessary. Staff officers spoke of balance, of preventing future conflict, of respecting alliance obligations. Few mentioned the individuals involved. Fewer still questioned whether victory required such compromise. The war narrative demanded clean endings, not uncomfortable footnotes. Eisenhower attended briefings and receptions. His public role unwavering, his private doubts carefully buried. Letters from the front arrived daily, some praising leadership, others hinting at unrest in transferred camps. Each envelope carried weight. Yet none could be answered without reopening settled decisions. Command meant moving forward, even when conscience lagged behind. Across Europe, displaced civilians watched borders harden. Flags change, and promises dissolve. The German prisoners became part of a larger silence, absorbed into post-war rearrangement. Their absence went largely unnoticed, eclipsed by reconstruction, trials, and speeches of unity. Only later would numbers surface. Whispered estimates of loss, suffering hidden behind victory. On that 9th day of July, the general closed his folder, stood, and prepared for another engagement. The cameras were gone, the moment preserved, the consequences unfolding elsewhere. What had been traded could not be retrieved, only remembered, if anyone chose to look. By 10 July 1945, the machinery of aftermath was fully in motion. Smooth on the surface, grinding underneath. Allied headquarters shifted focus toward occupation policy, reconstruction plans, and looming political fractures. The prisoner transfers were now classified as completed actions, stamped, filed, and quietly archived. Attention moved on, while consequences continued to travel east on steel rails. Soviet officials reported receipt of German manpower. Numbers presented as assets, not human beings. Labor quotas were discussed openly. Mines and factories waiting for bodies to fill quotas of revenge. For the prisoners, the war had not ended. It had simply changed uniforms and languages. Survival became currency, traded daily for obedience and silence. Eisenhower toured liberated cities, shaking hands amid rubble, listening to speeches about peace. Crowds cheered him as a liberator, children waved flags, and journalists recorded every step. No one asked about the vanished columns. No one mentioned agreements signed in pencil. Victory required heroes, and heroes could not hesitate in public memory. Behind closed doors, some officers expressed unease. Rumors circulated of harsh treatment beyond Allied oversight. Intelligence notes were marked sensitive. Distribution limited, urgency deliberately reduced. The alliance with Moscow was already fragile, truth risked shattering what remained. Silence again became the chosen instrument of stability. Across camps in the East, men counted days without calendars, measuring time by hunger and exhaustion. Letters were written but never sent, names were spoken but never recorded. The idea of a Western promise faded quickly, replaced by the reality of indefinite captivity. Their fate was no longer part of strategic discussion, only of survival. On that 10th day, Eisenhower signed another set of orders. Routine, administrative, necessary. History continued moving forward, indifferent to what had been left behind. The photograph endured, the decision hardened, and the cost kept accumulating unseen. On 11 July 1945, cracks began forming beneath the polished surface of Allied unity. Subtle but undeniable. Diplomatic cables crossed the Atlantic carrying cautious language, hints of concern, and carefully measured restraint. Some American officials questioned the long-term wisdom of strengthening Soviet leverage through human transfers. These doubts arrived too late, and without force, to alter what had already been done. Eisenhower read intelligence briefings that morning. Reports describing labor camp expansion deep inside Soviet territory. The numbers were imprecise, intentionally so. Yet the scale was impossible to ignore. Men transferred as prisoners were now categorized as workers. Resources to rebuild a shattered empire. The distinction mattered on paper, not in reality. Publicly, the general spoke of cooperation, stability, and shared sacrifice. His words echoed across radio broadcasts, reinforcing the image of Allied harmony. Privately, he understood. The alliance was shifting from wartime necessity to post-war rivalry. Every concession now would echo into the future. Among the German captives, despair hardened into routine. Resistance replaced by endurance. Some attempted escape, others collapsed under exhaustion. Most simply disappeared into numbers. Their stories merged into the background noise of rebuilding Europe. No tribunal waited for them, no headline marked their passing. American soldiers guarding former German zones noticed the absence. Camps once full now stood empty. Questions were asked quietly, then dismissed as irrelevant to new missions. The war's moral clarity was dissolving into shades of gray. Victory no longer felt clean, only final. As evening fell on that July day, Eisenhower stood alone again, reviewing maps that now showed occupation lines. He had navigated war successfully, but peace demanded compromises he could not fully control. The decision was behind him, yet its shadow stretched forward. History had accepted the trade, even if conscience had not. By 12 July 1945, the world's attention drifted toward conferences, tribunals, and the promise of a new order. Newspapers spoke of justice, rebuilding, and accountability. Rarely of those already consumed by the transition. The transfer of prisoners faded from discussion, buried beneath larger narratives of peace. Silence once again proved effective. Eisenhower attended strategy meetings focused on occupation logistics, food distribution, and demobilization schedules. Every agenda item reinforced the idea that the war chapter was closing. No one revisited earlier choices, not because they were forgotten, but because reopening them served no purpose. Command culture rewarded forward motion, not reflection. In Soviet-controlled zones, the German prisoners were dispersed, separated, and stripped of identity. Names became numbers, units dissolved, and survival depended on physical endurance alone. Reports of death from exposure and exhaustion accumulated quietly. These losses were not tallied in victory statistics. Back in Washington, political leaders praised Allied cooperation, framing compromise as strategic maturity. The American public embraced peace, eager to move beyond sacrifice. Complex moral trade-offs had no place in celebration. The photograph of Eisenhower remained, clean and reassuring. Within Allied intelligence, some analysts warned of growing mistrust between former partners. They traced early fractures back to moments like these, where convenience outweighed principle. Their assessments circulated narrowly, influencing future planning rather than public understanding. The seeds of the Cold War were already planted. On that 12th day, Eisenhower concluded his duties with practiced calm, his reputation intact. The cost of his decision was dispersed across borders, invisible to most. What remained was a victory narrative that demanded belief. And belief, once accepted, rarely asked for evidence. On 13 July 1945, unease began to surface in places far from headquarters. In conversations that never reached microphones. Junior officers exchanged glances. Supply clerks noticed discrepancies, and transport logs told incomplete stories. The machinery of war had slowed, enough for reflection to creep in. Questions formed, even if answers were discouraged. Eisenhower received a personal memorandum that day. Quietly worded, carefully framed. It referenced treatment of transferred prisoners, citing second-hand accounts and intercepted reports. Nothing was definitive, nothing actionable. Yet the implication was unmistakable. The decision was still echoing. He folded the paper, placed it beneath others, and moved on to scheduled meetings. Leadership required composure. Hesitation could fracture authority. The war had taught him that uncertainty, once visible, became dangerous. Doubt was to be managed, not displayed. In Soviet camps, discipline hardened into routine brutality. Men weakened by hunger collapsed at work sites, replaced without ceremony. Survival depended on silence, compliance, and luck. Their suffering remained beyond Allied jurisdiction, and therefore beyond responsibility. Across the Atlantic, American newspapers celebrated returning soldiers and peacetime prosperity. Stories of sacrifice were framed as necessary, losses as honorable. No column space existed for inconvenient aftermaths. Public memory simplified what reality had complicated. That evening, Eisenhower reviewed a draft speech on post-war cooperation. Its language was hopeful, deliberate, and reassuring. He approved it with minimal edits. Aware of the distance between words and experience, history often favored those who controlled the narrative. On the 13th of July, the war's moral residue lingered quietly. The general had won battles, secured alliances, and shaped the future. Yet somewhere beyond the reach of speeches, the price of image over humanity continued to be paid. By 14 July 1945, the rhythm of post-war Europe settled into something resembling normalcy, though it rested on fragile ground. Rail stations reopened, markets stirred, and flags were raised over ruins that still smelled of fire. The absence of hundreds of thousands went largely unremarked. Swallowed by the scale of destruction, peace had a way of obscuring its own costs. Eisenhower traveled between command centers, discussing troop reductions and future leadership roles. His name carried weight, his image symbolized restraint and victory. Behind that image, decisions remained unspoken, absorbed into official record as necessity. Public faith depended on clarity, not contradiction. Within intelligence circles, retrospective assessments began quietly. Analysts compared prisoner transfer outcomes, survival estimates, and long-term geopolitical effects. Patterns emerged that suggested short-term harmony had come at human expense. These conclusions stayed confined to classified rooms. In Soviet territory, German prisoners adapted or perished. Some learned new routines, others vanished into labor statistics. Hope shifted from liberation to endurance. Time became their only negotiator. Meanwhile, American soldiers prepared to return home, their war ending cleanly. They carried stories of liberation, camaraderie, and victory. Few knew what had followed the surrender. Distance protected memory from discomfort. On that July day, Eisenhower reflected briefly, alone with reports that could not change the past. The decision had served its immediate purpose, stabilizing alliances and projecting control. Its moral weight remained unresolved, suspended between justification and regret. History would eventually ask what price was acceptable for a photograph. On 15 July 1945, the first quiet reckonings began. Not in public halls, but in private correspondence and memory. Former officers wrote personal notes, questioning moments they had once accepted without pause. Distance from command allowed perspective, and perspective brought discomfort. Victory no longer silenced every doubt. Eisenhower reviewed long-term strategic forecasts that day, documents predicting ideological division across Europe. They described spheres of influence hardening into borders, cooperation cooling into suspicion. Early compromises were cited as foundations of future imbalance. The transfer of prisoners lingered as an unspoken example. Across the eastern camps, survival statistics stabilized into grim consistency. Deaths were not dramatic, but cumulative, erosion rather than catastrophe. Men aged quickly, bodies failing under labor and scarcity. Their disappearance blended into the arithmetic of rebuilding. In the West, war crimes trials were being planned, narratives carefully structured. Justice would be selective, focused on clear villains and documented atrocities. Ambiguous choices made by victors found no courtroom. History preferred clean moral lines. Eisenhower prepared statements for upcoming conferences, emphasizing unity and responsibility. His words would help shape the emerging world order. He understood that leadership required forward vision, not retrospective guilt. Still, the weight of earlier decisions pressed quietly. That 15th day passed without ceremony, another step away from war. Yet beneath the calm, consequences continued to unfold. The photograph remained iconic, the prisoners remained unseen. Time was closing the distance between choice and legacy. On 16 July 1945, the world turned its eyes toward the future, even as the past quietly settled into permanence. In the New Mexico desert, a new weapon was tested, power redefined, and history accelerated beyond familiar limits. The age of total war was ending, but the age of moral consequence was only beginning. Decisions once framed as temporary now became permanent. Eisenhower stood at the threshold of a new role, no longer just a wartime commander. His leadership had delivered victory, preserved alliance, and projected stability. The cost of those achievements remained diffuse, scattered across borders and years. Legacy, he understood, was shaped by what endured, not what was debated. The German prisoners transferred east were absorbed fully into history's margins. Some survived and returned decades later, others never did. Their stories emerged slowly, pieced together from memoirs, archives, and absence. They became evidence of choices made in silence. Post-war narratives favored triumph, order, and reconstruction. Complex compromises were simplified, moral ambiguity softened by time. The photograph endured as a symbol of control and dignity. What it concealed required effort to uncover. Eisenhower would later be remembered as a steady hand, a leader of restraint. Few accounts lingered on the moment when lives were weighed against optics. Yet history, when examined closely, always reveals its shadows. This was one of them. On that 16th day of July, the war truly ended for those in power. For others, its consequences stretched on, invisible but enduring. The trade had been made, the image preserved, the cost dispersed across generations. And history, as always, remembered what it chose to see.